The 19th century. England, despite the attempts undertaken in the 18th century, by such actors as Macklin and Garrick, to introduce greater naturalism into the theatre, the style of most performances remained high-flown and artificial with standardised gestures. In the 19th century, however, theatrical tastes gradually changed. More middle and upper-class people were going to the theatre, and a politer, more genteel style of play and performance was appreciated. The proscenium stage became the norm, with boxed sets imitating scenes from real life. The early years of the century were still dominated by the acting styles of Sarah Siddons and her brother John Philip Kemble, but, with the advent of Edmund Kean in 1814, a more romantic style came to prevail. To the poet Coleridge is attributed the much-quoted comment, "To see Kean was to read Shakespeare by flashes of lightning." And Byron noted in his diary, "Just returned from seeing Kean in Richard. By Jove, he is a soul. Life, nature, truth without exaggeration or diminution." Leigh Hunt, the romantic critic, commented that Kean seemed to actually know the passion he invoked. "Kean knows the real thing, which is the height of the passion, manner following it as a matter of course, and grace being developed from it in proportion to the truth of the sensation." For the critic William Hazlitt, Kean's acting had the stamp and freshness of nature, and he wrote, "He is possessed with a fury, a demon that leaves him no repose, no time for thought or room for imagination." Kean's responses to such views of him are enlightening, and have a ring of truth that doubtless applies to all good acting. He complained to the widow of Garrick that the critics were mistaken. "These people don't understand their business. They give me credit where I don't deserve it, and pass over the passages on which I have bestowed the utmost care and attention. Because my style is easy and natural, they think I don't study, and talk about the sudden impulse of genius. There is no such thing as impulsive acting. All is premeditated and studied beforehand. A man may act better or worse on a particular night, from particular circumstances, but although the execution may not be so brilliant, the conception is the same." Another giant of the 19th century was William Charles Macready. Critics of the time noted that he reminded them of Kemble, but in speech and gesture seemed to have borrowed much from Kean. Distinctive about his style was his preference for introducing small, everyday details into highly tragic sequences. Hazlitt wrote, "Mr. Macready, sometimes, to express uneasiness and agitation, composes his cravat, as he would in a drawing-room. This is, we think, neither graceful nor natural in extraordinary situations." It was, however, indicative of the growing taste for realism in the theatre. The dramatist, director and actor Tom Robertson did much to hasten the development towards a more realistic style, together with the actors Marie Wilton Bancroft and Squire Bancroft. The actor John Hare, 1844–1921, wrote of Robertson, "As nature was the basis of his own work, so he sought to make actors understand it should be theirs." He thus founded a school of natural acting, which completely revolutionized the then existing methods, and by so doing did incalculable good to the stage. The last decades of the 19th century were dominated by the names of the great actor-managers: Sir Henry Irving, Sir Herbert Beerbohm Tree, and Sir George Alexander. Irving was renowned for his idiosyncratic playing of the major Shakespeare roles, and in contemporary melodramas. They somehow managed to blend the styles of Kean and Macready, with at least some superficial trappings of a Robertson-style naturalism. The socially and psychologically profound and disturbing plays of Ibsen were beginning to be introduced, though George Bernard Shaw, in his championing of Ibsen, found that the contemporary English theatre was not equipped to do justice to his plays. Jacob Thomas Grain, 1862–1935, did mount a production of Ghosts in 1891, however, and with this set up his independent theatre, in which he also produced Shaw's first play, Widowers' Houses. The company collapsed in 1897, but it inspired the setting up of many other experimental theatres devoted to the new realism. Shaw had much to say about acting, in the familiar, forceful, arrogant style he applied to almost everything he wrote. Sir Henry Irving he dismissed for his hackneyed stage tricks. Of Beerbohm Tree he wrote that he felt that he needed nothing from an author, but a literary scaffold on which to exhibit his own creations. He stressed that technical accomplishments alone do not make an actor. By themselves they will no more make an actor than grammar and spelling will make an author, or fingering and blowing a bandsman. France. The Romantic movement in France, despite the notorious opening night in 1830 of Victor Hugo's Hernani, with its bevy of oddly dressed poets, did little to change the theatre scene. Most popular at the time were the prose comedies and dramas of Eugene Scribe. In Scribe's play Adrienne Lecouvreur the actress Rachel, Eliza Felix, 1821–58, made her name. She had been a poor street singer, and came to dominate the stage of the Comédie Française over next 15 years. She had excellent diction and a graceful presence. Although she wrote no account of her method of preparing a role, it would seem from the words she is reported to have uttered on her deathbed, that she had no time for artifice, and needed to understand and identify fully with her role. In studying for the stage, take my word for it, declamation and gesture are of little avail. You have to think and weep. A leading actor in the second half of the 19th century was Benoît Constant Coquelin, 1841–1909. He resigned from the then Théâtre Français in 1886, and went on tour in Europe and to America. Eventually, in 1892, he set up a company of his own. His particular forte was the classic comic roles, though he also played serious roles in contemporary plays. He has left a precise description of how he built up a role, which should not be unfamiliar to modern actors. When I have to create a new role, I begin by reading the play with the greatest attention, 5 or 6 times. First, I consider what position my character should occupy, on what plan in the picture I must put him. Then I study his psychology, knowing what he thinks and what he is morally. I deduce what he ought to be physically, what will be his carriage, his manner of speaking, his gesture. These characteristics once decided, I learn the part without thinking about it further. Then, when I know it, I take up my man again, and closing my eyes I say to him, recite this for me. From the 1860s till the outbreak of World War I, Sarah Bernhardt dominated the French stage with her great beauty and carefully calculated effects. Bernard Shaw wrote that her acting was not the art of making you think more highly or feel more deeply, but the art of making you admire her. He wrote also, she does not enter into the leading character, she substitutes herself. Her lack of concern for realism was evidenced supremely by her appearance on stage at the age of 71, after having had one of her legs amputated. Ironically, in her book The Art of the Theatre she stresses the importance of naturalism and adds, fidelity to the truth does not always distinguish in our present-day art, and the public will not tolerate a glossing over of reality. Some mention must be made of François Delsarte, 1811–71, if only because he was to become influential in America, via so-called Delsarte recitation books, and was referred to, albeit critically, by the leading exponent of the method school of acting, Lee Strasberg. Delsarte attempted to formulate strict laws of speech and gesture, and Strasberg wrote of him, in the 19th century the Frenchman Delsarte becomes dissatisfied with the routine acting techniques taught in his time. Aware of its mechanical and stultifying character, he grows to realize that under the stress of natural instinct, or emotion the body takes on the appropriate attitude or gesture, and this gesture was not at all what his teachers taught it was. But unable or unwilling to rely on what he had discovered, he tried to create a new series of elaborate pictorial descriptions that ended by being just as mechanical as those he originally broke away from. At the turn of the century, André Antoine established the first successful experimental theatre in France, the Théâtre Libre, which rejected all that the Comédie Française stood for, and introduced the kind of naturalism suitable to the plays of Zola and Hauptmann. It was also his deliberate policy to use untrained amateur actors. Germany and Austria. In the early 19th century, an actor came to the fore in Germany, who was well suited to the moody, psychologically complex roles in the new romantic drama. The style of acting of Ludwig Devrient was generally considered to be emotionally uninhibited. His first great success was as Karl Moor in Schiller's The Robbers. So much did he exert himself in his performances that, on one occasion, he could not complete a performance of King Lear. The excessive emotionalism of his acting and his passion for drinking caused his career to be short-lived. The Devrient family also spawned other men of the theatre. Two of Ludwig's nephews, Karl August and Gustav Emil, became leading tragedians, and Eduard, another nephew, became director of the Hoftheater, Dresden, and then of the Karlsruhe Theatre. Between 1848 and 1874 he published a huge 5-volume study of the history of acting in Germany, Geschichte der deutschen Schauspielkunst. In this he advocated a natural style of acting as opposed to the style practiced at Weimar, which he condemned as antiquated and pretentious. He himself had also acted, and he described his approach thus: "I have always yielded to the impression which the nature of the role has evoked in me. I have always tried to give what I have seen and inwardly felt in the part. Never have I thought out, or devised particular nuances in order to highlight a specific point." Generally regarded as one of the finest theatres in Europe in the 19th century was the Burgtheater in Vienna, Austria. The dramatist, Heinrich Lorby, who had been associated with the politically left-wing Young Germany movement for a while, was its director from 1849 until 1866. Lorby became renowned for being one of the first directors to prepare very precise instructions for each of his productions. The theatre clearly combined all that was best in acting techniques in the period, because it became the ultimate goal of all German-speaking actors to act in the Burgtheater. In an article on the Thymic family of actors, Maria Danton wrote, "To be a member of the Burgtheater was in those days the dream of every German-speaking actor. The fountainhead of histrionic tradition, exigent in technical standards, unrivaled in range and variety of repertory, the names of some of its greatest actors have transcended the limits of language." In the second half of the century, one particular German troupe, the Meiningen Company, was to have international influence. It was established by the Duke George II of Saxe-Meiningen, 1826 to 1914, who encouraged ensemble acting and historical accuracy in all aspects of the productions. Much time and attention were given to thorough rehearsals. The company performed in all the major capitals of Europe and influenced specifically the founder of the French Théâtre Libre, André Antoine, who admired their handling of crowd scenes, and the leading Russian theorist Stanislavski, who was eventually, however, to criticize the Meiningen approach, especially for the disciplinarian methods of its stage manager, Ludwig Kronek, the type of director who made the actor a stage property on the same level with stage furniture, a pawn that was moved about in their mise en scene. Thus, while the Meiningen Company encouraged better ensemble acting, it also paved the way for the dominance of the régisseur, from the French régisseur, in the German theatre. As in France, the end of the century saw the advent of naturalism in the theatre, with the Freibühne in Berlin being directly influenced by the Theatre Libre, and realizing the naturalist ideals of its leading light Otto Brahm, the main difference being that the Freibühne was able to use a fully equipped theatre and professional actors. This theatre in its turn inspired the setting up of the Freie Volksbühne, which aimed to provide realistic drama for the working classes under the slogan Art for the People. Russia in the early 19th century, the Russian tragedian Pavel Mokolov, 1800–48, became famous for his performances of Shakespearean heroes, especially Hamlet, very much in the fiery romantic style. He wrote, "Spiritual profundity and a flaming imagination are two qualities which form the main components of talent," adding, "Only when an actor has the ability to imagine what he himself is living with the mind and soul of the audience, that is, when he can force the audience to share his joy and tears, force his imagination vividly to conjure up the scene, in a word, only when the actor feels keenly his position, then for a moment, can he force the audience to forget itself." There are traceable links between the early theorist of stage realism, Michael Shepkin, 1788 to 1863, and the Stanislavski School. Shepkin insisted on having actors justify every detail of their performance and every gesture, which had to be rooted in a psychological understanding of the character. To the actor Chomsky he offered the following advice: do not reject criticism, but search for its deeper meaning, and in order to test yourself and the criticism, always keep in mind nature, crawl under the skin of your character. So to speak, study well his particular ideas, if there are any, and do not even exclude from consideration the social influences of his past. Then, no matter what situations are taken from life, you will always express them truthfully. You may sometimes play poorly, sometimes only satisfactorily, that often depends on your own inner disposition, but you will always play truthfully. Russia in the early 19th century. The Russian tragedian Pavel Mokolov, 1800–48, became famous for his performances of Shakespearean heroes, especially Hamlet, very much in the fiery romantic style. He wrote, "Spiritual profundity and a flaming imagination are two qualities which form the main components of talent," adding, "Only when an actor has the ability to imagine what he himself is living with the mind and soul of the audience, that is, when he can force the audience to share his joy and tears, force his imagination vividly to conjure up the scene, in a word, only when the actor feels keenly his position, then for a moment, can he force the audience to forget itself." There are traceable links between the early theorist of stage realism, Michael Shepkin, 1788–1863, and the Stanislavski School. Shepkin insisted on having actors justify every detail of their performance and every gesture, which had to be rooted in a psychological understanding of the character. To the actor Chomsky he offered the following advice: do not reject criticism, but search for its deeper meaning, and in order to test yourself and the criticism, always keep in mind nature, crawl under the skin of your character. So to speak, study well his particular ideas, if there are any, and do not even exclude from consideration the social influences of his past. Then, no matter what situations are taken from life, you will always express them truthfully. You may sometimes play poorly, sometimes only satisfactorily, that often depends on your own inner disposition, but you will always play truthfully. The playwright and director Alexander Nikolaevich Ostrovsky appealed to Tsar Alexander III to establish an inexpensive theatre with drama for the people, and based on ensemble acting. He was eventually to found the Russian Academy of Dramatic Art. In 1898, Konstantin S. Stanislavski, 1863–1938, created a theatre, together with the playwright Vladimir I. Nemirovich Danchenko, in which they planned to produce carefully rehearsed, naturalistic performances of both Russian and foreign plays. It became famous for the first successful productions of the dramatist Anton Chekhov. Stanislavski's writings were the first and are still the most extensive body of theory about the nature of acting, and they span the last decades of the 19th century and the first 4 decades of the 20th century. His ideas were rooted in his experiences of 19th-century acting styles, but his influence was to be most pervasive in the 20th century. It makes for greater coherence, therefore, if his ideas are considered at the beginning of the section on the 20th century. America. From the beginning of the 19th century, these English actors tended to dominate the scene, some of them staying on to work in America permanently. Many other famous names went there on tour, such as Macklin, Kean, Charles and Fanny Kemble, etc. The native-born James Henry Hackett, 1800–71, became famous as Falstaff, and was the original Rip Van Winkle. Edwin Forrest became the first real native star of the theatre, and appeared in many roles especially written for him, as well as playing the leads in Macbeth, King Lear and Othello. His style of acting was greatly influenced by Edmund Kean, and he would tend to adopt statuesque poses and speak in a declamatory style. He became the standard against which, for a long time, all other American actors were measured. The first great American actress, Charlotte Cushing, 1816–76, styled herself closely on the English actress Sarah Siddons. By the 1850s, a more naturalistic style began to appear, especially as evidenced in the portrayal of Hamlet by Edwin Booth. Another actor in this vein was Joseph Jefferson, who was described as acting with good taste and restraint, combined with a capacity for great tenderness and pathos. Louisa Lane Drew took over the management of the Arch Street Theatre, Philadelphia, in 1861, and established a stock company with the best actors of the period. Another influential company was Augustine Daly's company, which could boast the English actor Maurice Barrymore, who married Louisa Lane Drew's daughter Georgiana. They produced a renowned family of actors, Lionel, Ethel and John. By the end of the century, although a realistic style of acting was common, a precursor of the star system was dominant, and audiences tended to be attracted by star names rather than other qualities of the productions. Repertory companies had given way to the production of commercially successful plays in New York, which were then sent on tours in so-called road companies. Control of theater companies was gradually transferred from actor-managers to businessmen, and the concept of show business was born. Italy, one phenomenon of the dramatic scene in 19th century Italy, should not be overlooked, attaining as it did a role of international influence, that of the actress Eleonora Duse, 1858 to 1924. She was born into a theatrical family and started acting at the age of 4, becoming famous later in roles which had also been performed by Sarah Bernhardt. She eventually toured many countries in Europe, Russia, America and South America, and is mainly remembered for her performances in the plays of Henrik Ibsen and Gabriele D'Annunzio. She was a much more introverted person than Bernhardt, and was preferred as an actress by George Bernard Shaw, who saw them both. She developed a role, by what she termed elimination of the self, allowing what she conceived to be the inner sufferings and joys of the character to take over her own personality. She also argued famously that the theatre as it existed in her time should die. It was suffocating. It should return to something akin to the Greek open-air theatre.